Molly Newling qualified as a master gardener in 2013 after a lifetime of growing flowers and vegetables. She's especially interested in pruning woody plants and increasing the use of native plants in our gardens to support local wildlife and improve native ecosystem. And then Joan McIntyre has been an Extension Master Gardener since 2015. She conducts public education programs on sustainable landscaping, mosquito and tick management without harming pollinators, of course, and best practices. She works with other Master Gardeners to spread information on sustainable landscaping and best practices through neighborhood and social media platforms and various in-person events. She founded the Cherrydale Garden Club to bring neighbors together to share their experience and love for gardening and participate in neighborhood efforts to promote trees and native plants. She also currently serves on Arlington's Climate Change, Energy, and Environment Commission and volunteers for Eco Action Arlington. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Molly and Joan. I'll come back online to help to facilitate through some questions, but please take it away.
Morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. Now that the weather's starting to get cold and plants are actually starting to go dormant, this is kind of a good time to see how to kind of take care of those chores that need to be done in the fall and get ready for winter. As just a review for people that aren't familiar with Master Gardeners, we're trained volunteers through the Virginia Cooperative Extension Service, working in Alexandria and Arlington. Ben already mentioned that we staff a help desk 5 days a week in the mornings, but we also have plant clinics. We have lots of classes like this, demonstration gardens, and then generally out in the community. I strongly encourage everybody to look at our website. It's got a wealth of information, as does the extension service itself. So what are we going to talk about today? First off, it's kind of thinking back and preparing for next year, and then thinking about the planting that you can do. Fall's a good time for planting. We'll talk a little bit about garden cleanup and tool maintenance, and then also thinking about some things for winter, like supporting wildlife and also reducing the use of rock salt and other cold temperatures. So now is a good time to really kind of think back and let's celebrate successes. Not everything grew. Some things grew, some maybe not so well, and some didn't survive. But there's lots of things that would have come up through the year and you would enjoy. Nature is very resilient, so we should celebrate that and really kind of take advantage of what did well and kind of think more positively about what we can do in our gardens. So now it's kind of good time to really reflect back on what happened over the year and how we can actually take what we learned from what happened to prepare for next year. What surprises, kind of good or bad, what things did well, what things maybe did perhaps too well, and what plants may have struggled. Are there weeds or invasive problems that you're dealing with constantly? What about water issues, standing water, erosion? What would you like to actually do with your yard? Are you getting the most out of it? So now's the kind of time to really think about these things and think about what some of the solutions or ways of planning for next year might be. So certainly there's lots of problems of why plants aren't doing well. Too much or too little sun, too much, too little moisture, any disturbance or change. If you had a big tree come down, all of a sudden you have a sunny space and plants underneath were more attuned to the shade. So you've got kind of new opportunities, but also having to think about how you deal with that particular area. Disease, insect problem, particularly when the weather is stressful. Sometimes just plants are anemic. Why aren't they actually surviving? So there are a lot of different solutions. It takes a little bit of kind of thinking about where they are, but can you move the plants to something more suitable? Or do you even actually need those plants at all? Do a soil test. That's a good way of better understanding what soil conditions are and what you can do to improve. What can you do perhaps to manage water and the flows of water in order to kind of address some water issues. I actually would strongly encourage everybody to put in the chat of what plants did well, what survived, kind of your experience with this last summer, where it was really, with between the combination of fairly intense heat for long periods of time with considerable amount of drought with, interspersed by short periods of decent water. What plants were actually more resilient? In my yard, actually, I found somewhat seemingly non-intuitive, but there's kind of good reasons, is that those parts of my yard that tend to be moisture, and I really focus on plants that really like water, or actually some that even like wet feet. And those plants actually largely did really well. I did some watering in my yard, but mostly focusing on plants that were new and ones that I could see were struggling and not really aiming to get that 1 inch of water everywhere. But in these kind of moisture loving areas is possibly a couple of reasons. Is most of my soil tends to be clay, which is kind of common around here. And clay has the advantage of actually holding on to moisture. And then when you kind of add in lots of organic material over time, which again serves to hold moisture. But again, these plants also have evolved to handle stressful areas and conditions. So, we're a little better able to handle stress from drought than other plants. Then there's the prairie plants. The plants that thrive are really kind of summer plants that love hot, like the black-eyed Susans and the coneflowers and those types of plants have seemed to do pretty well. And then most of my mature trees and shrubs have done very well. They've been around for a long time, have extensive root systems. But the ones that have struggled are, first, it's also those plants that I would kind of call Goldilocks plants. They kind of don't like it too moist, but not too dry. But key one was the hydrangeas. They always tend to get fairly somewhat droopy as the weather gets hot and dry. So, and some of mine have suffered. Somewhat hopeful that there's still enough of the root system underneath that they'll come back. They kind of shoot up lots of canes and anyway. So we'll see what happens. Wild ginger I've had in one area for a long time, and that seems to be gone. Again, we'll wait until next year to see what happens. Newer plants, of course, are always ones that aren't quite well established and are going to be more susceptible to these types of conditions. And then there's the lawn. The turf, I think, in general has suffered. Most turf is cool season grasses, so once you hit hot and then dry, is pretty much suffer, and usually it can tolerate some degree of going dormant during the summer, but when you get these types of conditions, that really needs a little bit more attention. So I will stop briefly at this point, and if there's anything in the chat, and Molly, if you wanted to make any of your own comments of kind of what you dealt with and what you observed.
Joan, there's no comments in the questions in the chat yet.
If anybody had any thoughts of where they suffered.
Well, while people are thinking of putting in their own experiences, I will say I put in a native plant garden in a very dry, because it was a sloping piece of ground and full sun about 3 to 4 years ago. And I have been amazed at how much of that has not only survived, but actually thrived, and with very, very little care. I think some areas I did not water at all. Some areas I watered maybe once or twice through the entire summer where I have planted new things. 99% of them are fine. The goldenrod is blooming and the asters are blooming. Picking the right plants for your location is a key thing to remember here.
From the chat, we do have a couple of folks noting some struggles ahead over the summer. Pamela mentioned that her pagoda dogwood developed some sort of rust-looking disease, probably due to stress from the drought. Kathy mentioned that her zucchini grew well, but her butternut squash was taken over and eaten by critters. Unfortunately, rabbits also ravaged some of the leaves on her bean plants, but she's just now getting some green beans in her garden. Linda also mentions that with watering, peppers and eggplants did well, but her tomatoes did not. The pole beans, on the other hand, were good.
We're not emphasizing vegetables in this presentation because we had a program about a month ago or more on vegetable gardening, but it's true that tomatoes actually do not like to be too hot. They're desert plants originally, and they like a cool night, even if they have a warm day. And so mine just shut down during the July and part of August, and I just concentrated on keeping them alive. And then late August, September, they started producing again, but it's a struggle. I think the seed companies are coming up with more varieties that can deal with the kind of weather we're getting.
I'm just starting to get a few that are ripening if I can get to them before the squirrels do. They're not very pretty looking. Basil did really well for me, and actually my sweet potatoes are doing well, although I've had to struggle to keep the deer away. And I should have had good green beans, but the deer got to them before they got too big. So
Either the deer or the rabbits got the green beans
Yeah.
for me, or else they just, again, I didn't realize that, but when it gets too hot, the plants go in survival mode and they do not produce flowers or the product that you're looking for.
So let's talk about, kind of some solutions. Is first off, water problems, which, when we do get heavy rains and we seem to go from either feast or famine. So it's either completely dry for long periods of time, followed by fairly heavy rain, which doesn't necessarily do much, but certainly, you can see signs of erosion if you've got some water running down through your yard. You may have standing water in certain areas, compaction, dry areas. In my yard, I've actually got one area, it's kind of on an angle, so everything kind of slopes downward to one corner, so that area, that side tends to be fairly wet. And then on the other side, it's very dry between a couple of maple trees there that tend to suck the water out to begin with. And then it's just the water is moving in directions that keep that area fairly dry. So first off is really planting. Again, it's the old mantra of the right plant in the right place. Is, you can't really change many of these conditions. So think about what plants will do really well in both, very wet areas as well as very dry areas. And then may require a little bit of experimentation, but a lot of the resources that are out there on plants really give you at least some sense as to whether or not they prefer wet, moist, or dry soils, or some combinations. Then there are some kind of more engineering or structural things you can do to your yard in terms of helping to direct the water to address some of the problem. And we do programs, and we actually have one coming up on kind of water management that you might want to check out for more detail. Essentially, creating little streams that will direct water to a particular area where you actually may want to actually have a rain garden that captures the water, holds it, and allows it to infiltrate into the soil, or at least more slowly work its way into the watershed to avoid kind of broader problems of runoffs that we have in our stream and erosions, and help improve the general water quality. You may want to replace parts of, any pervious surfaces, patios, driveway, or impervious surfaces with more pervious surface to allow reducing the water flows, and again, directing it more towards being absorbed in the soil rather than being run off and going into the stormwater system. And rain barrels are a good option for putting it, capturing the rain and then either releasing it slowly after the rain, or you can actually then use them for watering and other uses around your house. So a couple of ideas of what you could do to handle water problems. And then think about having a plan. It doesn't have to be particularly fancy, just a few scratching out of kind of looking of what you have and where you may want to deal with. You can identify kind of problem areas. You can also really think about, what do I want to do to grow? How can I get the best and enjoy it more? Do I want vegetables, or maybe even some fruit, or do I want to put in more trees or shrubs to support wildlife? Can you reduce the lawn area? Where do you actually need the lawn for purposes of kind of pathways and moving through the yard, as well as just having areas where there's going to be a good bit of activity on? And lawn is kind of one of those few plants that actually can tolerate a good bit of walking around on it and activities. So, but again, it's thinking more deliberately about, what purpose is your lawn bringing, and then what might you want to do? And think about too is, can you put trees that'll help shade the house and help produce some of your energy conservation? You can also think about making sure that air conditioners are actually shaded, which will actually allow them to work much better. And then don't forget thinking about wildlife and pollinators and what kinds of plantings you might want to consider for that. And that will give you kind of an idea of what kinds of tasks you might want to be thinking about or planning for this fall and for next year, and actually over time. Also a real good time to do a soil test. By doing a soil test now, you'll actually get information about what the nutrient content is and what type of amendments that you might want to put down on your gardens and your lawns. It does take some time to allow the amended soil to actually kind of kick in. So thinking of doing it now and starting to amend now will mean that as you get into the spring, your soil will be in a better quality. Virginia Tech offers soil testing for a fairly reasonable price. And what you would do is do a soil test on different parts of your yard. Like the lawn would be different from a vegetable garden, which would be different from, some planting beds for a variety of different plants. And then the recommendations that come back will be more specific to the condition and the types of uses that you're using. And you can check with the help desk or the resources from Virginia Tech as to how to read the results and what to do. Fall is probably the best time for planting because the plants are going dormant, which will actually allow the plants to mostly put most of their energy into actually the roots and getting established. And again, you're going to have a bit more consistent water and better conditions and less stress on the plants. So good time to get in, particularly plants and trees, but you can also start thinking about what you want to do within any perennials you have. Do you want to plant or divide them? Do you want to add in spring ephemerals in particular? If they go in now, you'll benefit and see them in the spring. So again, thinking about that, what things you might want to do is this is the best time. Just a little bit of guidance in terms of planting and where you want to plant trees. One of the key rules is basically when you're selecting trees and shrubs, keep in mind what the mature size is going to be in the mature spread, and make sure that you're spacing between trees and shrubs in ways that will accommodate that. If you put them too close, they'll be crowded out fairly quickly, and then you'll have to do some remediation. Other things to look at is how far from buildings and other structures. Large trees, going canopy trees, want to try to get them about 20 feet from a one-story building so that they actually have plenty of room to spread out the roots and get established. Medium trees, small trees can be a little bit closer, about 15 feet for medium trees or 8 feet for small trees. And then for shrubs, also taking into account how big and what the spread is going to be, but also keep them far enough away from the foundation so you're leaving about a foot of space to allow some airflow and access for kind of healthier trees, and also just general importance for maintenance. And then do keep in mind with that is that this may apply to fence lines as too, and neighbors essentially can do whatever they want with anything that comes over to their side. So, hopefully you've got good neighbors and you all value and appreciate good, nice plantings and take advantage of maybe the shade that the tree in the next door yard is putting in for you. But do keep that in mind when you're making decisions. For planting, there's different trees and shrubs come in different packages. You can get bare roots, which would be the smallest. And basically it's just the roots with, they'll usually wrap it in some paper. I think you generally need to soak it in water for a little time. Hopefully it comes with instructions, but soaking it in water for about an hour or so before planting to help get it established. Fairly easy, kind of dig it in, make it wide enough so that you kind of spread the roots out a little bit. Most of us tend to get plants in containers, 1 gallon to 5 gallon containers. So what you want to do is there dig a hole that's 3 to 4 times wider than the container itself. One thing to really look at, root ball and trying to spread out and loosen up. If you've got, especially at this time of year, if you buy a shrub or a tree that's been in the pot for the whole season, it could be extremely root bound. So you may have to pull off some of the roots, especially along the bottom if they're really too get together. But the idea is really to try to shake out as much of the soil in there and help spread out the roots a little bit so that they won't just continue to grow in that kind of root ball area that they've created in the container and start to spread. These will be the really larger trees in that. They often come with wire and wrapped in burlap, but you have to make sure you take off as much of this as possible, and certainly make sure you get all the wiring out so you're freeing the roots so that they actually can spread. You're kind of getting it a wider hole to get settled. Now, in planting any of these, you do want to make sure that root flare, the area where the trunk meets the roots, is above the soil line. Otherwise, you're kind of basically suffocating the plant if that root flare gets buried too deeply into the soil. The other thing actually I found, and I just did some planting of shrubs recently, is that if it's an area where there's already trees and other things around, you may actually have to kind of play around with spacing because of roots from other trees. So kind of thinking that you may have to kind of adjust things a little bit, kind of keep that in mind so you're not doing too much damage to other trees. Plus, it's kind of hard to dig through there. And again, keeping in mind the spacing based on what the actual mature plant size is going to be. Some other planting tips in general. Actually, size makes a difference. I seem to find plants will do better if you actually get smaller plants. Even for trees and shrubs, they'll kind of get established more and they'll actually grow quicker. Another thing in planting, and probably should have mentioned it on the last slide, but you don't need to enhance the soil at all. Matter of fact, it's more detrimental to the plants itself if you add in any fertilizers or add in any mulch into the soil at the same time. I mean, you certainly can and should put some mulch around the trees or shrubs, but make sure you keep them away from the stem. But you don't really need to amend the soil. That actually creates more of a bowl and makes it harder for the roots to spread out. So for perennials, you can try to plant them somewhat closer together so that they can grow. So as they grow, they'll more quickly crowd out the weeds and get established. Again, the larger the pot, the size of the plant, you just want to go ahead and space accordingly. Again, especially if you're getting plants that have been around for a long time, is really loosen the plants and the roots so that they can get better established. Thinking in terms of pollinators, if you actually try to mass plants of the same plant in maybe a 3x3 square area, that makes it kind of easier for butterflies and bees to kind of jump from, because they tend to like to stick with the same plant when they're kind of collecting nectar at any one time, so that makes it easier for them to get feed and also then to pollinate. And then thinking about how you can actually deal with things particularly in the mint family that particularly like to spread and take over, that you can either plant them in containers or kind of use a hardscape area to keep them at bay and keep them from, kind of taking over everything. So then kind of thinking, is now a good time is to kind of take a look at your yard. I've got certain areas, which is actually an article I saw recently, and I think it was the Post that was talking about their garden and described it as chaotic. And that kind of describes parts of my own yard at times. So now it's kind of step back and see, are there, plants that have really kind of taken over, are pretty exuberant. Even your native plants will do that. Prioritizing any of basically the bad stuff, invasives that have come in, weeds and vines. At this point, since I didn't do a whole lot of weeding in the yard, it's really trying to do a catch up as the weather has cooled off and it's been nice to be out in the yard. You can start to move plants around, kind of areas where you're filling them in. One thing I'm going to try is some of these exuberant plants that really seem to like it where it's moist and sunny, that maybe they might be a bit better behaved in conditions that aren't quite as favorable, in areas that actually have been struggling to kind of get things to take over. And some can make pace with some volunteers, especially if it's kind of native plants. I tend to let the violets do what they'll do and then just remove them when I want other things to fill in. But they do actually make a good, nice ground cover, and they're a good plant for wildlife. It's the host plant for the fritillaria butterfly. And then, if you've got plants you're pulling out, try to share them with your friends and neighbors and give them free plants. Everybody's always seems to be happy to take free plants. And then think about starting to get beds ready for planting for next year. And actually the really easiest way to do it, and probably best for the soil, is to actually just kind of scope out the area that you want to have as a bed for next year. Lay down either several layers of newspaper or cardboard, and then cover with a couple of inches of soil or mulch. If you're using cardboard, I do recommend that you make sure you take all the tape off of the cardboard boxes before you kind of put them down, because that won't decompose. And I've had some landscapers do that, and I'm still pulling plastic occasionally out of the soil from from some of those boxes that were put down. Again, once you do this, everything's going to break down, including the grass or anything under it, and will help build stronger soil. So again, less work for you in terms of getting rid of what's there, and then you can actually just then plant the flowers or shrubs right through the newspaper. And then you can kind of think of doing this incrementally as, expanding a bed here one year and then expanding it a bit more the following year. And talk here a little bit more about lawn care and renovations, because at this point, given the conditions we had over the summer between drought and high temperatures, the soil is pretty much suffering quite a bit and could use some additional renovation. Do a soil test and see whether you need amendments, particularly lime to adjust pH if that's needed, but also to overseed some of the bare spots or across the grasses. You want to actually start by aerating or dethatching. The aerating actually helps break up some of the compaction and helps let some air in there. Dethatcher just brings up some of the organic matter that's kind of at the surface. The key here is to make sure that the seeds as you put down are really exposed to the soil, that they need that in order to grow. You might want to do some research on seed mix and what varieties are best recommended for Virginia. On the resources list, there is a link to the recommended turf grass list. Virginia Tech does, a lot of research on that, and they actually have some guidance of, how to find actually seed mixes that contain some of these recommended turf grass. You'll need to keep watering for about 2 weeks or so until the seeds actually get germinated. And once they're germinated, you might want to put some applications of nitrogen fertilizer. That's best done in the fall. It's best done over several applications. You don't want to put it all down at once. Check some of the resources in terms of what's the best types of nitrogen fertilizers to put down. And then finally, kind of think how your grass doesn't have to be pristine. It kind of doesn't have to be all turf grass. Are you willing to tolerate using, other clover? Clover works really well because it's a nitrogen fixer. So it kind of helps to fertilize in your grass. But are you willing, violets or other things as long as it's green? I think the real key for lawn and turf is to make sure that you don't have any bare spots, because the bare spots is what's more subject to erosion. And so you want to kind of prevent the erosion is some of the keys, or actually just rethinking, do you need the lawn? Where do you need it? And how can you do? And one thing particularly, despite what they say about being shade tolerant, there's really not a whole lot of turf grass seeds that are really, really tolerant of shade. So those are particular areas you might kind of want to rethink your landscaping. And you also might want to consider warm season grasses like the Bermuda grass. Now, I've had to come to terms with it because it's in my grass. It's very hard to get rid of anyway, but it does much better in terms of tolerating heat and drought. And so kind of you have a bit more green during the summer months when the cool season grasses tend to go dormant anyway and don't have necessarily the same kinds of watering requirements. So just some thoughts of kind of how to think about your lawn and how to kind of maintain it somewhat sustainably. And then you do want to make sure, especially that we now seem to begin in another dry period, is watering your plants, especially those that have been stressed over the last year. You can do this, especially for trees and shrubs, by using a soaker hose or drip irrigation kind of surrounding it, and just let it run slowly over a period of a number of hours. Usually those will give you a sense. Again, the rule of thumb is generally about 1 inch of water per week, and then you can water up until the ground freezes, and at which point it really won't be absorbed. And we can just hope we get more rain soon. I will stop here and take questions.
Joan, there's a couple of questions in the chat for you. There's actually 2 that have to deal with pH. Eva in the chat mentioned that she remembers hearing in a talk a while back that you really can't change the pH and other measures of your soil more than only temporary. So a soil test is useful to tell you what you have, but you should plant accordingly and not try to create the soil for the plants you want. She wants to know if you agree with that. And then Pamela was also had another question about pH. She wants to know if using wood chips or shredded bark mulches changes the pH of the soil, or is leaf mulch different on that point?
Yeah, I think the best strategy is to plant what's appropriate for the pH, because there is kind of a natural level of pH. Now, two areas where it does make a difference is if you're seeking to have healthy turf grass, that tends to require some more basic soil than actually what is kind of really typical in our area. And that's generally an application of lime. Again, the applications will depend on what you're trying to. You know, again, you only add what you need and at kind of the rates that are advised. The same is true for vegetable gardens. Again, they don't like acidic soil. But otherwise, it's really much easier is to, you know, plant plants that are best for the types of soil that you have. Some things are particularly kind of challenging, and the one thing is blueberries. Blueberries like it pretty acidic. You're either going to have to constantly adjust the soil to get to that sweet spot for acidity that will allow those plants to flourish, or you just might want to try something else. The other alternative with blueberries is maybe look at some dwarf varieties where you can actually put them in containers, and there you kind of have more direct control over the soil. Yeah. And then most of what I've seen in terms of mulch is that it doesn't really change that much in terms of the acidity. It would be fairly mild, and I know a lot of people, again, the advice is put in coffee grounds because it'll make it more acidic. But I think even something like that, the testing is that it's extremely modest. It really any implications at all.
Yeah, you really need to test before you do anything. Just don't just put down lime every year because your neighbor puts down lime every year. You're probably going to change the soil too much and not make it unfriendly to your plants. So you need to test first and only do what the test results say to do. You're going to have to work with your soil to a certain extent. You can't really change it radically.
Oh, Pamela wanted to know, when you're replanting something, how much of the potting soil that was in the original plant should be included, or is there a better use to put it aside? Amy also had a question on successful planting of Virginia bluebells, whether or not you thought seeds or seedlings would be a better approach.
And again, there's a limit to how much of the potting soil you can actually get rid of, because usually it's a pretty dense root ball. So I try to shake out as much of the soil as I can, so that, you know, mostly it's coming into contact with the natural soil that you're putting into it. Again, and most of that is really kind of breaking up the root ball a little bit so that the roots will spread. And then, as I mentioned, is, you know, you don't want to amend the soil. It basically changes the composition of the soil and makes it harder for the roots to actually spread. Kind of can create a little bit of a bowl. Either you've got to do the whole area in terms of adding in amendments of compost or mulch, or just keep adding mulch, or ultimately the plants that you put in will break down and you build organic materials much more naturally.
There's a reason for this. Most potting soil is very light. In our region anyway, you have to know what the soil is in your region. For people from Pittsburgh, I don't know. If it's clay and you keep the potting soil and it's all clay all around, it's making it almost like a clay pot around that plant, and the roots will never push out and expand into the native soils. You're trying to encourage that expansion by mixing the native soil with the came in the pot as much as you can to encourage the plant to spread out its roots.
There was the second question about Virginia bluebells, whether or not you thought seeds or seedlings would be the best approach.
Seeds will take longer to grow into a blooming plant. So if you want flowers right away, I would go with plants. They're not cheap, but they do reseed. I have planted bluebells. Did not expect results, to be honest with you, but they bloomed, and the seeds will drop into the ground and spread. They actually spread by water. With rain, we'll wash them around. So they do actually expand themselves. They are one of the classic spring ephemerals that Joe mentioned in the beginning. They will come up out of the soil before the trees and shrubs have made their any leaves, and they go through their whole life cycle before the trees leaf out. So that's when they get all their photosynthesizing done with the sun that comes down through the bare tree branches. And then they just disappear. You will not see them for the rest of the year. You'll think, okay, well, now they're gone and I'll never have them again. And next spring they come up again.
Says I've had good luck with them actually spreading, especially, give them some time and they will kind of spread. And I think I had one or two that I'm pretty sure just popped up from somewhere else because it was kind of before I actually started planting some, and I hadn't had them, but beautiful in the spring.
Lynn Chat mentions that she had bluebells restart in the crack between her driveway and the retaining wall, and they bloomed all year. So just co-signing what you were saying. Caroline has another question. She wants to know a little bit more about the relationship between planting herbaceous perennials with overnight temperatures that can maybe get frosty. Is it safe to plant those perennials when overnight temps are below freezing?
You could do them now. Oh, because the soil is still warm, it's not frozen yet. Once the soil freezes, you can't do that. But if you have plants in a pot that you've bought, I would go ahead and plant them now rather than wait till spring. They will survive, go through the winter better. Mulch them well. Don't drown them in mulch, but make sure there's at least a couple inches of good mulch around them.
Again, perennials are designed to deal with the change in temperatures. Once you put them in the ground, you've got the natural insulation that comes with the ground. Plant them, they'll go dormant the way they should, and they should pop up next year.
Snow is actually a good insulator too, if we ever get it.
Francis had just a follow up whether or not she should continue to water those perennials on cold nights.
As long as the soil's not frozen, you can water. Once it's actually hard and frozen, then you have to stop because the plants can't take it up then and they'll get waterlogged. But as long as the soil is not frozen and draining, you can water and should water, especially new plants.
That's it for the great questions for now, so we can keep going.
All right. So this is going to be a whole list of don'ts that instead of do's, which may be surprising to some of you, but that's the more ecological way to do things. The first one is not to go out and compulsively rake up every leaf that falls into your lawn and your garden. Leaves are the reservoir of all the nutrients that a tree or a shrub has pulled up out of the ground through the year. So they're packed with good stuff. And if you throw them away, you're just throwing away all the fertilizer and all the good things that you have put down for them, and you have to go out and buy more. So rather than buy all those chemicals, you can just keep the leaves on site and get the benefit. So you can leave them where they fall. If they're a foot high, they may be smothering your plants, so you'll have to be judicious. But if you can just lift them out by hand, but leave a couple of inches at least, they'll work as the mulch for your new perennials, and they will break down and fertilize your plants in the spring. On the lawn, if you use a mulching mower, which is basically just a plate that goes across where the grass or the leaves are ejected from the mower so that it gets recut within the machine. It's a very simple process. That will break up the leaves enough so that they can just fall onto their lawn and it won't smother it, but it will feed it. Or you can make a compost pile, which is an excellent thing to have anyway. We have programs on that in our virtual classroom, and we can give you the link to how to get to that, mgnv.org, and then /virtual classroom. If you are building a compost pile throughout the year, but the major component of a compost pile is a dried vegetable matter, and leaves are the classic thing to start with. Mother Nature will do the work for you. Right, here's another don't. And as a person who teaches pruning, this is important. Do not prune your plants in this fall unless you have a tree that's got a dead limb or there's a serious disease problem. And there's a very good reason for this. If you prune a tree or a shrub at this point in time, their natural reaction is going to be to push out more new growth. When you prune a plant, it encourages it to grow more. That new growth is going to be what we call tender. The twigs will not have hardened off. And so if there's a sudden frost, it's going to kill that whole twig and all the new leaves that are on it. And it may even winter kill further down into the plant. So let the plants go dormant and prune in the wintertime. The wintertime is the time to prune. Then it's easy to see the structure of the plant because you don't have to kind of fight your way through all the leaves. And there you can see if you want to reduce it in size, it's easier to see the structure of the plant and reduce it properly. If there is a dead branch, you want to get that out of there, because during the winter with wind and the weight of snow, it may fall down. So you be judicious. Don't do renovation pruning or decorative pruning in the fall. That's the one time you should not prune. Cleaning up, again, if you're doing a vegetable garden and there's still some things like tomatoes and peppers that are hanging on, you need to get them out before you really get a heavy frost. If you've left any of your potted plants outside for the summer, which many people like to do, and they will love it if not in too much sun, you need to bring them in. You need to bring it in for the plant's sake, and you often need to bring it in for the pot's sake, because in clay, anything that's in a clay pot, the pot will, if the soil freezes, actually it will break your pot too. If anything in your garden has had a disease, a fungus disease, of which I would say most of them have this year, because it was a bad year it was very humid as well as being hot. And so we around here had a lot of powdery mildew and other kind of fungal diseases. So don't put that in the compost pile, because it's just going to, all those fungal spores, if you put the compost back on your garden next year, they're right there ready to jump on your plant again. You have perennials that are seeding themselves wildly around your garden, you're just getting too much of them, then you would want to deadhead them. Otherwise, be very judicious about that. We'll get to that in a minute. So don't cut back everything. Timing, obviously everybody has a different freeze date. Around here, although it says for our region, November 1st to the 15th, it's actually more commonly closer to Thanksgiving, but every year is going to be different. So you're going to have to listen to the weather, and they will tell you when you can actually expect to freeze. Sometimes the first freeze, it's not going to freeze the soil. It's going to knock back some of your most tender plants, the impatiens and things like that will go. But other plants like geraniums will actually take quite cool weather. So you have a little bit of time. If you do have annuals that you like, I often take cuttings of the coleus. I have a particular variety of coleus that I like the color of, and I could take cuttings of those and bring them inside and keep them through the winter. I put them in a glass of water first to get some roots started, and then I'll plant them in soil for the rest through the winter. They're looking pretty shoddy by the spring, but when I put them out when it's warm enough, then they start looking beautiful again. But so you need to know when you're usually get a frost to make sure you're ahead of that. Keep your soil covered. Joan says you want to not have encourage erosion. So the more that you have something either growing in the soil or at least on the soil, it will protect your soil and also prevent compaction, which is a big enemy of your plant roots. We have winter weeds in this area. I was outraged when I moved here from New Jersey and discovered you have weeds in the wintertime as well as the summer. It just did not seem fair, but that's the way it is. If there's a nice day in February, go out and weed and stay ahead of those weeds, because they put out thousands of seeds. And so anything you can do to prevent those weeds from flowering and seeding is good. Weeding and mulching are going to be your two best friends on that. I'm putting down organic material, which is most mulches, some are better than others, to open up your soil. It's ironic, the adding organic material to your soil is good for both very light soils like sandy soils, and it's also good for very heavy soils like clay. For both of them, it helps them to hold water and to add air. People forget that air is very important to plant roots, but you want to have space for roots to get air so that they don't rot. And putting down mulches also will keep your plants from being heaved, is what they call, when the soil repeatedly freezes and thaws and freezes and thaws, it breaks up the soil, and you can see that the plants are actually pushed out of the soil. So putting down the mulch, it will keep the soil warm a little longer, but once it gets frozen, it will stay frozen. And your hardy perennials are fine with that. That's what they're developed for. How to do some of this, so we're going to get into the details here. Taking care of plants that overwinter, and mulching and cover crops. Those are all good ways that you cover the soil and make sure that it doesn't deteriorate, wash away, and it's ready with good tilth, they call it, a good composition for your plants next year. Now we're jumping to tool maintenance.
I think we're going to break for questions, but also somehow we managed to slip by the slide about cutting back perennials.
Okay.
You want to make a few comments on that?
Yes, cutting back, that is important. Thank you. Especially your native perennials. A lot of people are going into native gardens around here because those are the plants that do well here. Don't rush into cutting everything back. People tend to like everything to look neat and tidy going into the winter. But especially with the native perennials like the rudbeckias and the coneflowers, the grasses, those dead flower stems are where many native insects actually overwinter, either the insects themselves that are going to lay eggs next year, or they lay their eggs in there to hatch next winter. So if you cut all those off and dump them in a trash bag, or it's slightly better but not really good, put them in your compost pile, you are disturbing that life cycle of that insect and just reducing the number of insects, which mostly we need. That's what feeds the birds. They're the bottom of our food chain. We need insects. Very few of them are actually harmful to us, and most of them are beneficial. If you feel that you have to tidy up and to make things look better, just maybe cut off the flower heads, but again, be sensitive to the fact that a lot of those flower heads have seeds for the birds. So be thoughtful about it. As you get around toward late winter and early spring, and maybe things are beginning to look really kind of shoddy, maybe the flowers, the stems have fallen over. If you feel you really have to, or you want to make space get sunlight through, you can cut back maybe 2 feet 18 inches, and hopefully you will not have destroyed the insects, but take your time. You don't have to rush out and cut everything down right away.
Great. So just a couple of quick questions. Susan wanted to know if coneflower need to have green leaves on now to signal they're still alive and will be with us over winter. The second question from Tammy is, should you shred leaves before you put them in the garden bed or just leave them whole?
Many perennials will start to put out what they call a rosette, a new growth around the bottom of the plant, even though this flowering stem is maybe bare. And that's fine, you know, that's how they work. I don't know that they have to. If there's something that doesn't have that, you have a flower stem and no green leaves, it may be, it's worth trying to pull and see how much resistance you get. Rosetta flowers is pretty sturdy and will survive the winter. I hope that answers the question. And the other question,
should you chop up the leaves before you put them on your garden bed?
if you chop them up, they're going to disintegrate more quickly. Those will be incorporated in the soil more quickly, which is fine. But if you want those leaves to stay there through the winter and act as a protective base to your soil, then you can leave them whole. Some leaves mat more. Some leaves dry very quickly and leave air spaces, and some maple leaves especially will mat together in layers and take quite a while to rot down. And maybe you want a combo of both.
A lot of insects overwinter in the leaves.
That is true.
So by leaving the leaves, you're actually providing that habitat. So if you want fireflies next year, you know, you want to leave those leaves, and chopping them up will destroy that habitat. So where, you know, you seem to have an excess of leaves, you may want to chop them up, especially if you want them to decompose quicker, say in your compost.
Chopping them up, you might actually destroy the insects as well as the leaves. That's something to be aware of. Okay.
That's it for questions for now.
Yes, now we're jumping over for getting away from the plants and getting away from your tools that you have been working hard for you all summer. And you really should take care of them before you put them away the final time into the garden shed or wherever you keep them. Why? Because when you take care of them, they actually last better and they don't rust and they don't rot. Good tools are not cheap, so it doesn't take long to do what you need to do. With tools that cut, either your pruners and your clippers or the, say, shovels, they will work much better if you keep them in good condition and especially sharp. And then you also need to clean them to keep them from spreading diseases, actually to keep them clean, as we think of clean washing our hands, because that you can spread diseases if you don't do that. And when they work properly, they work well and safer for you, and it's better for the plants. So there's a number of things you need to do to actually clean the tools, to sanitize the tools, sharpen the tools, repair them if necessary, perhaps condition them if depending on what it is, and basically then store them in a proper place. So we're going to go through all of these. And there are going to be some little videos in here to show you how you actually do it. So this is the equipment you need. You're going to need some steel wool or a wire brush or sandpaper and claws. This is for the physical cleaning. Some kind of file or whetstone to sharpen. The boiled linseed oil or turpentine is good for the wood part of your shovels or any of your other tools. I don't know whether anybody uses a pickaxe in the garden. At one time I did. And to condition those wood parts of your shovels and other tools. Rubbing alcohol, which is your sanitizer. A light machine oil, which is for the metal parts of your tools. A vise or clamps. If you're the only one who's doing that, if you've got a helper, that's fine. If you're on your own, sometimes you need somebody to need a device to hold your tool steady, which a vise is very handy for. And then to protect you, safety glasses and gloves, either rubber gloves or heavy gloves. First, you're cleaning. Physically cleaning. You've been out there digging, you just planted your tree, the shovel is all covered with mud or soil. And so you need to get that off. You can wash it off with a hose, but then you're going to have to go back and use something abrasive, either your wire brush or your steel wool, to actually scrape the residual dirt off. If you've been pruning or working with evergreens, especially pine, it's all going to get sticky with the sap. And so Murphy's oil or some other soap is good for getting rid of that. And then if you're using a chemical sprayer, either mechanical or operated, that needs to be flushed through with water to get the residue out, or else it will corrode your equipment. So with just a few of the basic hand tools here, we have, this is where the video comes in. Okay. So, and this is the little video on working with your cutting tools, the loppers and the pruners that you use for pruning. And you're going to clean them with the Goo Gone. In this case, that's another thing that's good for getting off tree sap, and just rubbing it all over your tool and getting it all cleaned out so it looks nice and a little bit more shiny. And then to sanitize it, if you've been cutting, if you have anything that you know is diseased, you should definitely be doing this between each cut. Even if you don't know it, don't think it's diseased, it's not a bad idea, just to put it in the alcohol for 30 seconds to a minute. Okay, sharpening, you have to be sure you're holding your sharpener at the same angle as the blade is now. And for this tool, you're only sharpening one blade, the one that is at an angle, and then following up with the oil to make sure that it doesn't rust. Now you're ready. The next time you need to go out and prune, you're going to be all ready. It's going to be in good shape, and you can just take off and not have to get your loppers or pruners back into shape. Shovels, very similar. First, you're washing it off. Then you're making sure you get the whole thing. Then you're again wire brushing, get off the rust, which will inevitably be there, especially if you left it outside by mistake. And then cleaning it, drying it off. This is the edge. If you've hit a stone, you've often got a little nick in there. So now you're going to take your sharpener and actually run it at an angle, about a 45-degree angle or a little less, along that edge. And you can see how it gets nice and bright and shiny. That means that you've got a good edge on there. And then coating it with oil to keep it from rusting. And then you want to store them in a dry place, whether it's your garage, a tool shed, in your basement, wherever it is, but you need to store them in a dry place. Now, this is a little bit of detail. When you're sharpening, there are different blades that need to be sharpening depending on the tool. So a hand pruner or a lopper or a grass shear, you're only sharpening one edge. You don't do both sides, you only do one edge. And that's the one that's at an angle. You have to keep your sharpener at the same angle as it is on the tool in order to do it properly. Otherwise, you might be making it more dull rather than more sharp. So most of the tools you are only sharpening are one blade. Sometimes, in the case with picks and mattocks, you're actually, or the grass shear, you're sharpening both sides. So you have to know which one to do it. There are online resources that will tell you this. And if you're doing something like a hay fork, you've got a ton of different ones, and it's going to be a pain, but you have to sharpen each one. Or a spading fork, which is a tool I like to use a lot. And if you or have a saw that's gotten dull, frankly, the easiest thing is just to replace the whole blade, which you can get a new blade at a hardware store or online. There are people who sharpen each single little triangle in a saw, but it takes forever. So that's not really cost effective, I don't think. You have to repair all the equipment you have, make sure that any screws or nuts and any of the equipment you use are solidly fastened. You can sometimes, on a good tool, actually get a new wood handle if they've started to crack, if it's been left outside and gotten wet and started to deteriorate. You sometimes can replace the handles. Cheap tools, usually you can't, so you'll have to double check. But you can buy new handles for an axe or a shovel in some good hardware stores. And of course, also you have to keep up with your hoses. They've had a hard time this summer. They've worked a lot to make sure that you don't have leaks and everything. So when you put things away, they're ready to go for next spring. You can buy hose repair kits in almost every hardware or big box store. So this is taking care of the actual handle of a tool. So if they've gotten rough, you can sand them down. You can wipe them to condition them with linseed oil or turpentine, and put rust inhibitor on the blade and also on the moving parts of the floppers. If you use linseed oil or turpentine, you're going to have to be very careful with how you dispose of the rags that you put it on with, or even paper towels. When you're sanitizing, you need to soak it for at least 30 seconds in 70% rubbing alcohol, which is very easily found in pharmacies or online or in grocery stores. But that will kill the pathogens that you don't want to transfer from one plant to another. If you're pruning something that's got boxwood blight or some kind of disease, you want to be sure you're doing this. Don't use bleach, which is often recommended, or pine saw, because it will corrode the metal on your tool. You've paid a lot of money for this tool. You want to take care of it. So use alcohol. Storing things, store them dry. Make sure the hoses are all drained out, so that it's much better to bring them inside. The only hose you could really leave outside, one of those soaker hoses that are porous, but any rubber or vinyl hose you want to bring inside. You're going to need to drain your rain barrels, because otherwise when they freeze, it will crack the barrel itself. And it's better to actually bring the rain barrels in, but if you don't have a place to do that, if you could turn them upside down so that they, rain or snow water doesn't get in there. And also your terracotta pots. I remember I mentioned earlier that don't move those inside. Once they get wet in the fall and then freeze, they will break. There are a few very expensive ones that are supposed to be treated. Wood pots, plastic pots, metal pots you can leave outside, but not the clay ones. Mowers and other power equipment have to follow the owner's manual. I know that mowers have to be drained or should be drained of the gasoline. Anything you do on one of these things, make sure you either take out the spark plug or you take out the battery before you do anything on it. You want to make sure they don't turn on while you've got your hands anywhere near the cutting parts. Your safety is extremely important. If you're doing anything where it's possible something could get into your eyes, wear protective glasses, wear heavy duty gloves when you're working with something like a hedge clip cutter. Use clamps to hold your tools so that they don't fall on you by accident. And always follow the directions. And the linseed soaked rags, I said you have to be careful about that. Those can actually catch on fire without a match or anything. It's a chemical thing. So you need to either store them in like a metal can with a lid. It's considered hazardous waste. So you need to take those to a recycling or your waste disposal place for your county or your municipality, and they will have a place to put them in, but you can't just dump it in the garbage because you're going to cause a big problem. So take care of your tools and you're taking care of yourself. It's a fun part. There is wildlife in the winter, and people actually probably notice it more because there's no leaves on the trees. You can see the birds that stay and the squirrels that stay, and people like to feed them, and that's okay. There's two schools of thought on feeding birds, and I think they're both okay. If you feel the birds can get what they need from nature around them, as they did for thousands of years, then it's nice if you give them a little more help by planting some things that will support them. But if you want to feed them and see them, that's all right. But you have to be careful about that. We'll get into that a little later. Waiting till spring to cut the native perennials back. We discussed that already. Leaving the seed heads from the native flowers intact, and actually introducing plants into your garden that will attract birds and other wildlife is something that's very good to do. But if you're feeding the birds, make sure they're in a cat-safe location. One of the major things that's killing birds, besides running into buildings, is domestic cats who will kill them. You have to have the feeders out in the open, not too close to shrubs or brush piles where predators can hide. Try not to buy the cheap stuff from the hardware or the big box stores. They really need a seed with a lot of oil in it, because they need the fat to keep them going in the wintertime. And clean the filters regularly. This is really super important. We had an outbreak around here a couple of years ago of birds that were having eye problems. They were just basically going blind. Nobody really quite figured out what it was, but one of the culprits very well might have been diseases that they picked up at a feeder from one bird to another. So you should be cleaning your feeder probably at least once a week. More frequently is fine, but just don't put this stuff in there and leave it for forever. It will mold as it gets wet and whatever. So you have to maintain a feeder if you're going to do it. Road salt. Road salt's a bad thing, unfortunately, for native climate plants. And I know it keeps us safe, but it's harmful for the plants and the pets and the wildlife. You can't control probably what the city or the county puts on the roads, although you could advocate, but certainly around your own property, you can try to use as little salt as possible. One is just to keep the walkway when it comes on to snow, to just keep shoveling or sweeping quickly so it doesn't accumulate and you have to use or melt and then freeze, so that you have to use a chemical to keep the sidewalk clear. Use different types of chemicals instead of sodium chloride or sand or kitty litter, other things for traction. There are other chemicals that aren't quite so corrosive as classic salt. And you don't have to put down tons of it, especially as we're getting warmer and warmer here. It doesn't get as cold and it doesn't freeze as often, so you don't really have to keep dumping salt on there. And clean it up once the ice is gone and the weather was warmed up. Don't leave it just to drain into your lawn and your planting beds and into the rivers. Okay, so we have some more programs coming up. Prescription gardening, which is for your health and also to protect yourself, I think, while you're gardening. And then stormwater management, which is a big issue around here because we have so many paved surfaces. Anything that you can do on your property to keep the water on your property is good for you and for your community and your waterways. Does anybody have any final questions? I guess is the next thing to ask.
Molly, there's no additional questions.
Oh, there were some links there. I don't know whether you saw them, how to get in touch with us. And maybe Caitlin will put them in the chat as well, so you will get that at home, especially the mgnv.org, where we have a ton of information, including all the videos like this that we have recorded. They're up there for you to watch anytime, and a lot of information about native plants, focused on the Northern Virginia area, but some of them grow further afield. If you live in the area, please come out to our program, our outdoors next tomorrow, starting at 10 o'clock at Buddy Ford Nature Center. So thank you very much for your time and your attention.